In designing strategies for decarceration, it is of vital importance that we evaluate the prison industrial complex for what it is. The issue at hand is not overcrowding of prisons or the increasing rates of incarceration, but the existence itself of a system that is designed to maintain racial and class hierarchies through state-sanctioned violence. The affirmative's willingness to capitulate to a liberal half measure to stop this beast is exactly the type of policy that gives it the legitimacy and perception of humaneness to continue ruining the lives of people of color across the state. Our Murakawa quotation is very apt here. Her analysis of the 1968 Safe Streets Act tracks well with the development of Prop 47 as a bill that claims to raise funds for reinvestment in neighborhood programs and schools, but in fact will be used for rehabilitation programs and drug treatment facilities that are prisons in another name. Our evidence indicates that the BSCC is in charge of managing all funds collected by Prop 47, and that this organization is staffed by ex-law enforcement officials who want to support programs that keep youth of color locked up and keep them under the long arm of the law. Additionally, the point that we've brought up about parole is not adequately addressed by the debaters from Harvard. They claim that we have a step in the right direction, that there is some people getting out of prison. This is true, but it's important to remember that these are early numbers. The bill has only been in effect for 4 months, and our evidence says that all of these people will be held under parole, subject to mandatory drug testing, checking in with law enforcement officials, and that 75% of these people nationwide are reconvicted within 3 years, which means that their claim of tens of thousands of people getting out of prison is nothing other than a sleight of hand. Additionally, the framing of the urgent need for Proposition 47 relies on this assumption of a mass decarceration that is not guaranteed. You should not subscribe to their emotional blackmail that forces you to agree to something that isn't really what prisoners need just because of the strong rhetoric of letting people out of prison. Their claim that we could generate momentum for more reforms is in fact the opposite. Our Justice Now organization, the organization Justice Now, agrees with us that Proposition 47 saps political energy and momentum for increased, larger reforms against the prison industrial complex. Think of Brown versus Board of Education. Despite the fact that statistics showed in the 1980s that schools were more segregated than they were in the 1950s, nobody was allowed to raise public issues about school segregation because de jure segregation under the law had been already eliminated by Brown versus Board. It sapped the political energy from the conversation and made people think that everything was all right when in fact it had worsened. The Safe Streets and Neighborhood Act of Prop 47 does the exact same thing by convincing liberals that they have already dealt with the problem of prison overcrowding and allowing them to ignore the more fundamental problem of prisons' institutionalized racism, which will undoubtedly continue. Their focus on nonviolent offenders ensures that the people that are most subjugated by the prison industrial complex, held for life, have no chance to get let out of the prison system. And in fact, their identifying of some criminals as deserving of release reinforces the opinion that the rest of the criminals are deserving punishment and that they are receiving punishment from a just criminal law system, which is not the case. Our arguments also prove that the call for an immediate change to the prison system is itself a problem. We do not, They have demanded that we immediately propose an alternative to the prison system to deal with rapists, murders, etc. The alternatives to the prison system should be developed when we have made true political gains against the prison system, which Proposition 47 is not. The first task is to fight against the increasing reach of the carceral state, and if we prove that the affirmative does not do that, then we do not need to provide a better way to do it. Additionally, you should view prisons as an institutionalized form of rape and murder. Guards sexually and physically assault inmates constantly, and with many of them dying and being raped by these guards. State-sanctioned prison violence is not outside of the law, and you should understand the prison as a technology of rape and murder. Additionally, evidence and statistics suggest that prison makes people more violent rather than rehabilitating them. Solitary confinement and other extreme penal measures have been shown to debilitate prisoners' mental health and make them more prone to further violent crimes once they are released. According to the National Institute of Justice, 75% of these offenders, once released, commit more violent crimes, largely because of the experience they had in prison. Ending this state-sanctioned technology of sexualized and racialized violence is a better strategy to reduce the overall incidence of rape, murder, and other violent crimes in our society. The affirmative's half measure only provides a smiley face on the evil prison system that America uses to subjugate the poor and minority people in America today. I'm now open to cross-examination.
What is one example of an alternative to one crime that would be dealt with, not in prison?
You're saying any crime at all?
No, one alternative program, for example, that could replace putting a person who commits a sexual assault in a system.
Our argument is not that no person should ever be quarantined or in prison, but rather that the prison industrial complex that exists in America today is indefensible. After we get rid of the private prison system, the mass warehousing of people of color, we can have policy discussions about how to deal with rapists and murderers in a humane way, but that conversation can only occur once we've made legitimate political gains against the mass incarceration system, which Prop 47 does not achieve.
Okay, I think that sounds a little nicer than it is, but I actually want to talk about something you said in the beginning part of that. You said that we can kind of talk about it after. So, for example, these things happen daily. Is the only person who would respond to a murder like a first responder to deal with the victim of that murder?
Prisons do not prevent rape or murder. Prisons make rape and murder more likely and more vicious in every area of society. Your claim that the police's presence acts as a deterrent on rape and murder is not supported by evidence.
So you make you sort of whipped that it's not that we can never put people in a cage. Of course we can do that sometimes. It's about these broader discussions. What is distinct about the putting people in cages that you do after the discussions and something that happens after Prop 47 helps 10,000 people make it so that they no longer are separated from their families and children?
Well, I think first your question relies on a host of assumptions about Proposition 47 that we have contested. But secondly, I would say that the difference is that our political stance is willing to call under question the distinction between nonviolent and violent offenders, for instance. You are not willing to do that. The bill subscribes to the very demonization of violent offenders that provides the bedrock of institutionalized racism in the image of a thug that must be contained, etc., etc. Only the negative's radical stance undoes that logic of criminality, which is the backbone of institutional racism in America.
Excellent.
Hello all. When thinking about this debate, I think there's one thing that we all ought to keep in mind. Decarceration is an urgent task. There are people who even now are languishing in prisons on spurious felony drug charges. When you get 5 to 10 years for shoplifting one too many times, it can destroy your life. Every week, one person dies in the California prison system as a result of overcrowding. They say overcrowding isn't the issue. I say it is one of many issues. We can't simply wish away the existence of a penitentiary system writ large. We have to contest the particular kinds and the particular modalities of injustice that exist in our everyday. Lives and livelihoods are at stake. The difference between parole and prison might not seem very significant from these pleasant steps and from the admittedly superior Californian weather, but it is a world of difference to someone who's just trying to get home. 10,000 people eligible for resentencing on the reduction from a felony to a misdemeanor doesn't sound like much when you're taking a view from nowhere, but it matters quite a bit to those 10,000 individuals. I want to talk for a little bit about the value of reform. They say reforms are dangerous. They say reforms are mystification. They say reforms sap political energy to the future. But I'd like to turn each and every one of their examples back on them. They say Brown versus Board enforced a de jure form of desegregation that stopped us from being able to really desegregate our schools. The analogy to this situation would be for them to advocate the abolition of schooling. Nobody wants that. Nobody's for that. The entire point is that there are institutions in our society that are necessary for the proper functioning of the social contract, which we all agree. The answer to the Brown versus Board of Education problem is not to abolish the schools, it's to investigate the particular ways in which schools are not bastions of equality now and to fix them. Prop 47 is an example of doing precisely the same for the prison system. The Civil Rights Act. Similarly, it's not that we shouldn't have done civil rights. It's not that the marches were a bad thing for protesters and activists to engage in. It's that our fight is never over. It's that every claim for justice and every clamor for more equality is fragile. And we should never forget that our fight is never over. We shouldn't resort to the easy answers. Oh, it should all go away. We ought to engage in ideological critique of the prison industrial complex. No doubt we should do these things. However, it's important to keep in mind that we need to take pragmatic steps in order to improve the lives of the people who are part of our communities and people who are part of our society writ large. They say that there is a distinction between violent and nonviolent crime, that this distinction is spurious. I quite simply do not agree. Murder and rape are not the same thing as shoplifting, which is not the same thing as a drug offense. It's quite simply not the same. We can argue about the value of the existing prison system on rehabilitating and reducing recidivism in murderers and rapists. No doubt it's not as effective as it could be, but that is in large part because of overcrowding problems. That's in large part because prisons simply do not have the resources in order to better manage those who it should be caring for. Now, I think that there's another question that they mentioned about where the money is going. The BSCC, for example, will be routing this to the Department of Education, to victims' compensation funds, and yes, we cannot guarantee that all the money is used in a perfect fashion. No public policy would be able to guarantee such a thing. This is the problem with taking the easy route, with taking the moral conviction that we should be against prisons and the prison industrial complex in all instances, rather than a pragmatic and particularist view of the ways in which we can improve that system. These improvements will not be perfect, but they will open the way for a more humane and perhaps more just justice system.
Our colleagues from Harvard want to talk about what's easy for the prison industrial complex. All of our arguments have made it clear that what's easy is to accept small, minor, tangible improvements. Yes, the prison might be slightly worse than parole, but you should read all of this through our historical analysis. Our quote from Naomi Murakawa and all of her historical research demonstrates that the prison industrial complex gets its lifeblood from half measures.
It gets its legitimacy from things that say that it is a tangible improvement and things that don't understand the myriad of ways that the prison system uses to oppress and destroy the lives of people of color. The majority of the last speech that was given starts from the presumption that Proposition 47 is somehow going to make these improvements, that it is the type of pragmatic reform that they're talking about. We can take steps in the short term to ultimately end the prison system, but Proposition 47 is not indicative of any of those steps. First of all, they have no good explanation of what will happen with the money that's reinvested from cutting budgets. He says that the BSSC has to send money to the Department of Education. The BSSC has gotten money for this very purpose before. And when it's gotten that, all it's done is use that money to build new prisons, new juvenile detention centers, and new cages for people of color. It's been used to ramp up policing. The 1968 Safe Street Act, which was used as a way to protect people of color from institutional racism and white supremacist riots, was then later used to develop tanks by the police to storm the Black Panther headquarters. Unless they can explain what measures are in place to ensure that the money won't go towards other things, it's indicative of how Proposition 47 rearranges the ways in which the prison industrial complex hurts and destroys communities of color. Moreover, they say that Brown versus Board of Education was good and that the alternative to that would have been abolishing the school system. Our argument is not that the school system needs to be abolished, but that we need to make radical improvements. We need to change redistribution of wealth that causes it so that certain communities are segregated from other communities. Proposition 47 doesn't do that. For example, in LA, in which they released people because of the benefits of Proposition 47, that caused an increase in the sentences of people that were already there. People that were released early because of prison overcrowding got 90% increases in their sentences. Proposition 47 isn't the type of reform that they're looking for. Our Murakawa evidence and our analysis from history proves that when reform is done in ways that isn't meaningful, that it distracts from broader efforts. He says that we need to investigate the particular ways, modalities, and technologies of injustice and work against them. It's Proposition 47 that keeps us from doing that. Justice Now, a prominent local Oakland organization, has come out and said that Proposition 47 would sap political energy from more important reforms that could potentially come. We have given examples of ways in which we can be pragmatic and keep in mind that the ultimate goal is the abolition of the prison system. But short-term reforms that don't recognize the necessity of that goal, that say that we need to make small, tangible improvements, will ultimately, in the end, detract from what could be potential investigations of the different ways in which the prison system destroys communities, and detracts from ways that we can challenge that and take meaningful actions. Thank you.
In this debate, the con asks you to sacrifice real short-term improvements in the lives of real people for a lofty ideal, which could be 50, 60, or 1,000 years in the future, of an America with no violence and no crime, where we can deal with things in an easier way from removing people from society necessarily. I challenge this prioritization of concepts of violence with lofty terms rather than the real lived experience of many people, in some instances millions of people who have felony convictions preventing them from access to social services, that can have their records redefined now because of this legislation, so that tomorrow they can get housing assistance if they need it, or food assistance if they need it, etc. Reform efforts are enough to give us a prison system that is weaker and easier to deconstruct, not the opposite way around. California, specifically, is the worst offender in many of the worst practices of the U.S. prison system that internationally are repudiated and only practiced by a few countries and even a few states. Things like solitary confinement, forced sterilizations, intense modes of youth confinement, etc., as well as overcrowding that my partners talked about, all lead to a prison system